Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. Everybody knows about the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, New York landmarks that attract millions of tourists and local visitors every year. But what about Hamilton Grange in Harlem, Federal Hall, Castle Clinton, Theodore Roosevelt's birthplace, and the Stonewall National Monument? All of them designated national monuments, and all of them within trekking distance of Manhattan. They're overseen by the National Park Service, and here to tell us about the abundance of nationally recognized historical sites right around New York City is Joshua Laird, Commissioner of National Parks of New York Harbor at the National Park Service. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You've got a long title.
It's a mouthful, yes.
So you oversee 11 national parks and 23 destinations and what's designated is New York Harbor.
That's right.
Including a church that's in Mount Vernon, New York, and a beach that's on the Jersey Shore. So what geographical area are we talking about when we talk about New York Harbor?
Well, we're really talking about the entire harbor area. So from the outer harbor outboard of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, the gateway from the Atlantic Ocean to the inner harbor, and all the boroughs that touch on the harbor, which are really all 5 boroughs of the city.
Okay. Now, I mentioned the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, which everybody knows about, but there's also what's called the Gateway National Recreation Area. I don't know if most New Yorkers know there's such a thing. You know, when we think of national parks, we think of things like, Yellowstone, we think of the Grand Canyon, but there's this whole area of sort of natural wonders right around New York City. And the Gateway National, tell me about the Gateway National Recreation Area and what's in it.
Sure. Many people may know the individual destinations within the park, even if they don't know the entire construct, because Gateway National Recreation Area actually spans 26,000 acres of land and water. It's divided into 3 units. There's the Jamaica Bay unit, which is on the southern flank of Brooklyn and Queens. There's the Staten Island unit, which is 3 different sites along the south shore of Staten Island, and then the Sandy Hook unit, which is in New Jersey.
And what do you find there?
An incredible mixture of nature and history. And one of the overarching themes of our sites here in New York is harbor defense. And so almost all of these sites had, at one time in American history, military installations that were intended to protect New York from any sort of potential enemy invasion. So we have these incredible places of history, but then you have another legacy of these areas, particularly in Jamaica Bay and Staten Island, where the sites were largely left alone and forgotten over time, and nature reasserted itself over decades of disturbance. So today, places like Jamaica Bay are incredible places of nature, places where all sorts of flora and fauna thrive. New York is actually an important destination on the Atlantic Flyway for migratory birds. So you can imagine, with all the paving and buildings in New York, pockets of green are a magnet for those birds as they fly through here. Places like Jamaica Bay and the wildlife refuge that we manage there are very well known in the birding community for the variety of birds that stop there.
And people outside of New York don't think of New York as a place where there's a lot of natural wonders, where you can go birding and
Sure.
kayaking and
Well, not
all those
compared
things.
to the great wide national parks out west, but I think what Gateway tells us is that even in a sort of lower quantity, nature plays an incredibly important role in cities. It's of tremendous value that we have these places for nature, for plants that help absorb stormwater, that runs off all of our paved streets, that helps cool the tremendous sort of heat generated by activity in the cities. Nature plays a very important role, so we need to take care of and cherish the areas of nature that we do have.
So we're not going to spend a lot of time on the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, but I will ask you how many visitors visit those sites every year? It's got to be.
Well, it's about 4.5 million
Okay.
at the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island.
Okay.
So they're incredibly popular destinations for visitors, school groups. I'd love to see more New Yorkers go visit these sites as well because they're such an important part of New York's own history.
Now, so let's talk about some of the designated parks right in New York City. So, I mean, we talk about, do we call them parks or do we call them monuments? I mean, sort of when you talk about it as a park, it's a little confusing.
Sure. They're all units of the National Park Service.
Okay.
We sometimes refer to them as in different ways. They're national parks, national monuments, national memorials, but they're all managed the same way by the National Park Service. And we do consider them park sites. They're different than what one normally thinks of in New York City as parks. The city has just an amazing municipal park system that serves a role in sort of the daily life and recreation of the city. Our sites are more about the stewardship of places of history and special places of nature.
So how do you get to be designated a national monument or a national park site?
There are two ways that sites come to the National Park Service. One is that Congress can designate a national park site, whether it's a national park, a monument, memorial. And then the other is specific to the creation of national monuments. The President has the authority under something what's known as the Antiquities Act of 1906 to designate special places as national monuments.
And I think we were talking in the green room about a Shirley Chisholm monument that's going to be part of in Gateway National Park?
That's actually a really wonderful partnership that's emerged between the National Park Service and New York State Parks here locally. A site within the Jamaica Bay unit of Gateway that has never been open to the public. It was a former sanitary landfill, a place where garbage was dumped for decades and decades, that's now closed and capped and has this beautiful rolling landscape of grasslands and trees, but has been more than the Park Service could really take on. And so the state of New York has agreed to step in and manage that landscape as a state park. So it's a state park operating within a national park site. They've named it Shirley Chisholm State Park to commemorate Shirley Chisholm and her importance to the city and that area of Brooklyn.
And when's that going to happen? Do we know?
It is happening now. They will open to the public for the first time this summer.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So let's look at some of the local monuments. Federal Hall. Now, I've been in downtown Manhattan many times, used to work down near City Hall, but I don't know, I don't know where Federal Hall is and didn't know about its significance until I started reading up for this interview. Tell us about Federal Hall.
It is the birthplace of American government as we know it today. It is the first, New York was the first capital of the United States under the U.S. Constitution. George Washington was inaugurated as our first president on the balcony of Federal Hall.
Which is on Wall Street, right? On
Wall Street, directly across from the stock exchange. Most people will recognize its beautiful front steps and the super life-size statue of George Washington out front. So he took the oath of office there, and the first Congress met there, first 19 months of the U.S. government under the Constitution, and was the most prolific Congress in American history, including the ratification of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that we know as the Bill of Rights.
Now, your office is located there, correct?
My office is located there. It is not the Federal Hall that was the first seat of American government. That building was sadly demolished in 1812. The current building was completed in 1842 as the U.S. Customs House. And then a few decades later, when the Customs House on Bowling Green at the Battery opened, Federal Hall became a part of the federal banking system. It was a part of the Federal Reserve Bank, and until 1920, gold and silver were stored in its basement.
Okay. I think there are a lot of people who've heard about the African burial ground, even if they haven't been there or even necessarily know where it is. Tell us, where is it, and just a little about its history.
Sure. Well, it's in Lower Manhattan, just a couple of blocks north of City Hall on Duane Street. What we celebrate today as African Burial Ground National Monument is actually a small portion of a much larger burial ground for enslaved and free African Americans from the 1630s up through the 1790s. As many as 15,000 to 20,000 souls are buried there. At the time that the burial ground was established, it was really outside the city proper, and you can
because at the time, if you were black, you couldn't be buried within the city. Isn't
that's
that
right.
correct?
That's exactly why it was located outside of the city proper. You know, I think one sort of uglier but important part of New York City that people need to remember is that until emancipation in New York in 1827, there was slavery here in New York. In fact, we were one of the two biggest slave trading locations in the United States. And so, you know, the burial of, as I say, both enslaved and free blacks who are also here, not allowed in the city proper. So this burial ground was established outside. And then, you know, at the time, we're talking about the native topography of Manhattan before landfilling had begun. The area was in a valley, about 30 feet, almost 30 feet below the sidewalks that we know today, because hills were knocked down and valleys were filled in as the city grew to create a mostly level surface for the city. So over time, although there was a lot of development in the area, the very few buildings had foundations so deep that they disturbed that burial ground. It was known, but I think outside the consciousness of a lot of New Yorkers until the construction of what is now the Ted Weiss Federal Building at 290 Broadway.
So are the bodies still there? I mean, they didn't dig them up, did they? Or did they?
They did. They were not prepared to encounter the remains as they did during the construction of the foundations for the Weiss office building. And so remains were uncovered. There was enough knowledge of the history there that there was an archaeologist who was a part of the construction team. But I think everyone was caught off guard by the extent of the burials that were found there. So there was disturbance at the time. The project had to be delayed. There were, within that footprint, remains were removed for examination. There was a partnership with Howard University, but they have been returned. So eventually, the site was designated a national monument in the first Bush administration, and there was an international competition for design of the outdoor memorial. The remains were all reinterred in the site. If you go there today, you'll find burial mounds on the surface that mark the areas where the remains are buried, and they're in receptacles below the surface, stacked as they would have been back historically.
Okay. We're going to take a short break. Then we'll be back with Joshua Laird, Commissioner of National Parks of New York Harbor at the National Park Service. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Sheryl McCarthy, and I'm talking with Joshua Laird, Commissioner of National Parks of New York Harbor at the National Park Service. You were telling me something during the break. Why wouldn't you repeat that?
Sure. I think one of the things that's so fascinating and important about our sites here in New York is they tell this incredible story, the full cross-section of American history, from the fight for American independence and the establishment of our government, to places like Ellis Island, which represents the place where people came from across the globe seeking freedom, to places like African Burial Ground National Monument that represents the story of people who were brought here in denial of their freedom. So it is that full and very important cross-section of American history, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Right. Going back to the American Revolution, Hamilton Grange, where is it? What is it?
Hamilton Grange is in northern Manhattan in its third location over the course of its history. It is the only home that Alexander Hamilton ever owned. It was moved once to get out of the way of the emerging Manhattan street grid. It was then moved by the National Park Service in the early 2000s. It had become hemmed in by buildings around it, and so it was lifted up and moved to a New York City park, to St. Nicholas Park, just around the corner from Convent Avenue, where it now stands today on property that was a part of the Hamilton estate, not in the historic footprint, but in a landscape setting that's much more evocative of what life would have been like for Hamilton and his wife.
Does it have anything to do with Hamilton Heights in Harlem?
Sure. Hamilton is among the most famous residents of that area.
Was it named after him? I mean, I guess that's what I'm asking.
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Most New Yorkers, I think, know about Grant's tomb. It's the General Grant National Memorial over on Riverside Drive, the burial place of the former president and his wife. I think I read an article recently in which the writer was arguing that monument is in disrepair, needs some work. Is that, I don't know. That's what the writer was saying. Is that true, or is it?
Like a lot of national park sites, there is definitely work that needs to be done to keep these aging buildings in good repair. We keep up with it as best we can with the budget that we have, but there is definitely a backlog of things that need to be done. We're hopeful in the coming years that there may be some additional money just to catch up on that backlog. But we are still an organization of craftspeople, of historians, and so we monitor these structures all the time, and we are not going to let anything happen to them that's irreversible, even if we need to sort of stabilize things until we find the resources to repair them.
St. Paul's Church in Mount Vernon, I bet that's a national monument that a lot of New Yorkers don't know much about.
It's probably the least known of our sites, but it is also connected to the story of American independence. It was used as a field hospital by the British during the Battle of Pell's Point in 1776. Not a victory for the Patriots. But General Washington ordered that the bell in the tower be removed and buried to prevent the British from melting it down for ammunition. That plan succeeded, and the bell was later returned to the tower where it hangs today. The burial yard connected with the church has both Patriot and British burials. It's really a wonderful site. Now surrounded by a more industrial neighborhood in Mount Vernon, so it sometimes gets a little lost. But
about how far is that out of New York City?
It's very close to the Bronx border.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The Stonewall National Monument, is that the most recent national monument in New York City?
In New York City, yes, it is
Okay.
the most recent. It was designated in 2016, and it is the first national park unit that is designated because of its connection to the history of the gay rights movement. And so that makes it a very significant site.
And it consists of the Stonewall Inn, Christopher Park, and the street where the gay men and women pushed back against the police during a raid back in 1969. And this month is the 50th anniversary.
That's right. It's a very significant anniversary
Right.
for us. So thanks to great support from the City of New York, Christopher Park was actually transferred to National Park Service ownership. That gave the federal foothold that allowed the Obama administration to designate the national monument. The inn itself remains private property. The building remains private property, and the surrounding streets and sidewalks remain city property, but they're all within our larger sort of boundary of interpretation that tells the whole story of the uprising that started in the bar, spilled out into the streets, into the park, and then lasted actually for about 5 days every evening as participants dodged in and out of the sort of quirky arrangement of streets in that area.
Is it still a functioning bar?
It is, although it's not the same bar that was
Okay.
there in 1969. That bar closed down after the raid. It never
Okay.
reopened, and so the storefront there has actually been a few things, but it's been a bar called the Stonewall since the 90s, I believe.
Of some of these lesser-known parks and monuments in New York, do you have any personal favorites that you like to go to, or that you would especially recommend people go to if they've never been there?
I really am reluctant to give away my favorites. I grew up not so far from the Theodore Roosevelt birthplace, and I used to
And that is
go there.
on...
That's on 20th Street
Okay.
in Manhattan, just off Broadway. And so it was the subject of a number of school reports for me growing up for
okay.
social studies class. So I have a soft spot for that place and for Theodore Roosevelt. But really, we tell such a broad story of American history here in New York that, depending on your interests, you can learn about the struggle for American independence, about our great Civil War general, about migration and immigration to the United States, about the history of slavery here in New York. And then, of course, there are these special places of nature if you're more of a person who enjoys the birding
Right.
or recreating. We have several really wonderful recreational beaches. We have Jacob Riis Beach out in the Rockaways, Sandy Hook Beach, and Great Kills has a beach as well.
Okay. As a person who has oversight of these parks and monuments, I'm sure you have a wish list. What do you want to see happen regarding these places?
I think, New York is a city that doesn't always stop to consider its history. We're so much about what's next. We're so forward-looking, but I think connecting with our own history is important. I think it's grounding as we do think about our own future. So we really want our sites, aside from keeping them in good repair and keeping them in good condition, I personally would like to see them become more of the sort of the lifeblood of New Yorkers, places that New Yorkers go to because they teach them something about their own communities and their own past. They should be engaging. The stories that we tell need to be done in a relevant way to connect with younger audiences. So those, I think, are the big challenges that face us going ahead. Getting people to appreciate history, getting people to appreciate the nature that's here in New York, and want to play a role in making sure these places are cared for into the future. One of the things I really would like to mention is that in addition to these sites that we manage, we have a partnership with the New York City Department of Education as the partner of a New York City public high school, the Stephen T. Mather Building Arts and Craftsmanship High School. Stephen Mather was the first director of the National Park Service, so it's named after him.
Where is it?
It is on West 49th Street. in the building that was once the High School for Graphic Design. It's a CTE school. It teaches, in addition to the Regents curriculum that the school teaches, it teaches about the preservation building arts. So that is the basis for our involvement. It's this focus on the preservation trades, carpentry, masonry, decorative finishing, and landscape management. So the students there are taking both their normal high school classwork, but they're also have a rich program of work-based learning exercises coming out to our sites.
Yeah.
It's a terrific program. The students graduate with their Regents diploma and with a certificate attesting to their professional skills, so they're both college ready and employment ready.
Okay. Well, I learned a lot about, places I didn't know about before. And we're out of time, but I want to thank Commissioner Joshua Laird for joining me today. To learn more about the national parks of New York Harbor, you can go to their website at www.nps.gov/NPNH. For One to One, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.